Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Radically Open Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, Addressing Perfectionism, Emotional Loneliness, and Quiet BPD workshop. So we have Amanda here with us, and Amanda grew up in Vancouver and is the founder of Open Concepts Therapy, a virtual clinic that provides radically open DBT. Originally, she became a social worker because of her own struggles with mental health and had the privilege of learning and working in many clinics across Ontario. She currently works individually with teens and adults and also runs a series of skills classes. She strongly believes that human connection, and not just through Instagram, is integral to our mental health. So I'll hand it over to Amanda now. And also, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat and we will answer them at the end.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bailey. And thanks everyone for being here and for taking time out of your day. And I'm super excited to hang out today and talk a little bit about Radically Open DBT. I know that DBT is kind of very well known and kind of throughout the, treatment options is kind of, always coming up. And I really fell in love with Radically Open DBT, partly because of kind of what I was looking for myself at the time and my struggles, but also thinking about some of the clients I have had who did regular DBT and maybe found it helpful, but it felt like maybe there was just something missing still. Or some people also, had found that DBT just didn't quite feel like the right fit. So I've been really enjoying kind of learning more about Radically Open DBT and practicing it for myself and with my clients. And I'm really happy to share it with everyone today. And yeah, thank you for that reminder, Bailey. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. I'm going to leave some time at the end for sure. Okay. All right. So as Bailey mentioned, I am originally from Vancouver. I was in Toronto for about 12 years, and I just moved back to Vancouver actually about 6 weeks ago. So I'm super happy to be back in BC. Here's a little bit of an agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start by talking a little bit about over control versus under control. And this is really going to help us understand kind of the difference between what DBT is focusing on and what RO-DBT is focusing on. I wanted to talk a little bit about quiet BPD, how RO-DBT can help, and then a couple more of the differences between the two. And then if we have time at the end, there's a little skill called self-inquiry that I wanted to teach. And it's something that you can kind of take with you and practice on your own if you'd like. I just put it in this photo here. This is Dr. Thomas Lynch, who is the founder of RO-DBT. Yeah, he worked as well with Marsha Linehan, who created DBT. They've kind of worked together on this. I've never met him, but I would love to. He seems like a nice guy. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between over control and under control. And regardless of kind of clinical diagnoses, so, regardless of what it says in the DSM or whatever, what we're really doing in Radically Open DBT is we're focusing on what we call over control. So it could be that someone has a diagnosis of anorexia or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or borderline, or anxiety or depression. And the idea is not that we're necessarily treating those diagnoses, but we're really focusing on the over control. So what is over control? So I guess research in the past had kind of seen or had kind of suggested that the more control we have over ourselves, over our behaviors, over our emotions, the happier we will be, or the psychological well-being will kind of go up in a way. However, what we're really learning is that some folks might have too much of this idea of self-control. Sometimes in RO, we talk about it as too much of a good thing. So, things like being able to manage impulses, being able to kind of keep our emotions in, right? Being able to work really, really hard at something, being able to kind of ignore how we're feeling and just get the work done no matter what. These are seen by our society as kind of things that we're applauded for, right? And now what we're really learning is that we can have too much of this control. So, and this can also lead to kind of a decrease in our well-being. I'm going to talk more about this in more detail as we go. Okay. So for folks who are more on the under-controlled side, and we tend to see this in, little kids, even if we talk about kind of temperament, right? Like some kids are like, oh my gosh, running around and knocking other kids out of the way and climbing the things and eating the cookie and jumping up and down and screaming. And other kids, just kind of by their temperament, tend to be a little bit more subdued or shy, or just kind of a little bit more careful. So we can see it, from a really young age. And it is partly just the way that brains are wired. So under controlled kind of temperament, people tend to have more of a high reward excitement. It could be like, oh my gosh, that was the most amazing pen ever. I love this pen, right? And just like super excited. And and then with over controlled, it might be a little bit less excitement, right? Something has to be like very exciting for them in order to feel that same sense of excitement. Okay. Big picture processing, right? We can kind of see how with over control, it's easier for folks to kind of maybe zoom out and see the big picture. All right. Where, they might be able to see the forest, but miss the trees, if we're using that metaphor. Whereas over-controlled folks tend to really, really be hyper-focused on the details. So, I've noticed for me, if I'm reading something and there's like a typo in it, my brain kind of gets really hyper-focused on that. And it's hard to kind of, go back to just seeing the article as a whole. So that's kind of an over-controlled trait. I'm using myself a lot in this presentation today because I tend to relate a lot to this stuff. And then lastly, this impulsivity and this idea of a high threat sensitivity. So again, with under-controlled, we seem to see more impulsivity, more kind of going along with our emotions or our moods, versus over-controlled tends to kind of be more able to kind of do things no matter what, which, you know, can go too far if we're like, oh my gosh, I feel, you know, I'm really, really feeling horrible and sad today. And, you know, I'm not feeling well, I'm sick, I have a cold, and I'm going to just like push through and do the work anyway. So sometimes knowing when we actually need to rest, and kind of listening to our bodies in that way, can kind of get missed. And then the high threat sensitivity. So this is really important as well, because for folks who tend to be more on the over-controlled side, it can feel like this constant anxiety. I heard someone describe it once as like, you know, video game music where the music comes on and it sounds like something bad is about to happen. It's kind of always having that music playing in the background. And you know, I was talking to some other clients in one of my classes the other day, and we were talking about how, you know, someone might go to the beach and look around and be like, oh, it's a beautiful sunny day, and, you know, there's ice cream over there, and ooh, I want to go jump in the ocean. Versus someone who's more on the over-controlled side might be standing on the beach and be like, oh my gosh, there's a dog over there that's not on a leash, and that kid's not wearing a life jacket, and the lifeguard isn't paying attention, or right. So it's just like really hyper focused, basically on threats, on things that could potentially go wrong. Okay. Awesome. I had a new client come the other day who was literally a safety inspector, and I was like, you got the perfect job for kind of the way that your brain is wired. Oh yeah, so I will just say this point down here as well. So these kind of pieces around biotemperament that we're kind of born with happen at what we call the preconscious level. So it's happening in about 6 milliseconds, that these parts of our kind of brain and bodies are functioning. So we put a big emphasis in RO-DBT on how we cannot necessarily talk or think our way out of these different things, especially with over control. It's that we really have to act our way out of them, because our bodies are already kind of there by the time our mind catches up. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the webinar. Okay. So this is just one of the ways that we kind of assess for over control versus under control. Again, this is not about diagnosing or pathologizing. You know, sometimes we can be really far, you know, on one side or the other, and it doesn't mean that we are struggling or needing, you know, support. But basically what this is the A column are words that we would generally connect with over control, or sorry, under control. And B is more words that we would generally connect with over control. So feel free to take a moment and kind of see if there's one or the other column that maybe jumps out for you. Some of them in column A, so this is more on the under-controlled side. We've got impulsive, impractical, naive, vulnerable, risky, talkative. And on the B column, things are more like deliberate or practical, aloof. So when we do the assessment, there's a whole bunch of more words. This is a very long list of words, and we kind of tally up if we have more in column A or column B, and that can kind of help us figure out whether we're more on the over-controlled or under-controlled side. So these are just some other questions to consider. And I'm just gonna read them out, and I'll invite you to just kind of reflect as we're going through them. Again, this is not about diagnosing or pathologizing or anything like that. It's just kind of interesting to think about, like, yeah, I wonder if some of this stuff kind of resonates. So do you believe that it is important to do things properly or right? Are you a perfectionist? Are you cautious and careful about how you do things? Do you prefer order and structure? Are you organized? Do you like to plan ahead? Do you think before acting? Are you able to delay gratification? Are you able to easily inhibit an impulse? Do you consider yourself conscientious? Are you dutiful? Are you quiet, restrained, or reserved by nature? Is it hard to impress you? Does it take time to get to know you? And are you likely to not reveal your opinion immediately until you get to know someone better? Okay. So these are some questions that I often kind of ask new clients who are coming in, whether these kind of resonate, and if so, then usually we would say that they're maybe more on the over-controlled side, and maybe RO might be a good fit. Okay. So one of the really important ones here is the "Are you a perfectionist?" question. And we're going to talk a little bit more about perfectionism here. Okay. So I think perfectionism is something that a lot of people kind of grapple with. And, I think today there is so much pressure on us and, on people in general to just be perfect, right? We have to do well in school. We have to do well at work. We have to, I don't know, follow societal standards. We have to do XYZ in order to be accepted. And so I think for a lot of people, it can feel like we have these really high standards. And with perfectionism in particular, the idea is that it can feel like our self-worth is dependent on whether these standards are met. So I like to talk about kind of the difference between perfectionism and someone who is just really like high achieving or hardworking. And some of us might be, really high achievers and have high goals and have, these things that we're working towards. And if those standards aren't met, or if we don't quite reach our goals, it's kind of like, okay, I did the best that I could. I worked really hard. I'm gonna come back to it tomorrow, or I'm gonna whatever, hang out here for a while and buy myself some lunch and chill out. Whereas with this kind of really intense perfectionism, it can just be like, oh my gosh, I am a complete failure if I haven't reached these high standards. Or as it says here, even when standards Oh, hey, there's a typo. All right, there's me practicing not being perfect. Even when standards are met, there might be no satisfaction, right? A perfectionist might tell themselves like, oh, that must mean that this task must have been too easy, right? So I need to push myself harder next time. Okay. There can be different belief systems that come into play here. So unless I can do it perfectly, there's no point. Um, and then sometimes this can lead to procrastination as well. So a lot of folks who come for radically open DBT might have perfectionism that is so intense that it kind of can paralyze us, right? And it's kind of that mindset of like, I am so afraid to even start this task, because if it's not perfect, then what does that say about me, right? I'm not going to be able to handle it. So this is something that that we really kind of focus on as well in RO. Okay. And then the last question here is, how is it reinforced? So again, I think this kind of speaks to societal pressures, right? This idea that we shouldn't make mistakes, that we should, be able to do a presentation without stuttering. And there's a lot of I think praise given to this idea of perfection, or being able to come across as perfect in our society. So we're kind of working on smashing those ideas in RO-DBT as well, because we're all human, we're all imperfectly perfect. Or perfectly imperfect, I should say. Okay. So the number one kind of underlying struggle for folks who come into RO-DBT is emotional loneliness. And it's really interesting if we think of perfectionism as almost this suit of armor. If I feel like I need to be coming off as perfect all the time, and when my friends ask me how I'm doing, I have to say, oh yeah, everything's great, right? I got a promotion, I got an A+, I did blah, blah, blah. We're really not letting people see the real us underneath. There's this part, there's this quote in RO that talks about how, like, yeah, we don't love our friends because maybe I don't know, they have a yacht and they go on 10 trips a year and they have $1 million. We usually love our friends because they have been vulnerable with us, right? They've shared their flaws and they've shared their mistakes and they've shared their insecurities and their struggles with us. And that's how, at the end of the day, we really bond with other people, is to kind of show that vulnerability. So, a lot of times folks will come into RO and say, like, I can be in a room full of people and I can still feel this sense of loneliness. And we kind of can get deeper into how maybe people, do people actually know you? Are you putting on this facade? Are you wearing your suit of armor? What would it look like to, take off a glove once in a while and see what happens? Okay. And all of this being said, we definitely want to remember that oftentimes we have a suit of armor on for a reason. Maybe in some parts of our life, we need the suit of armor to keep us safe. Maybe we needed it when we were younger to keep us safe. And so it is very context dependent as well, about finding the people or the places where it actually is safe to take off some pieces of the suit of armor. Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit now about how this connects to quiet BPD. And I'm mindful that there may be some people here who kind of identify with this as well. And we can see some of the traits really kind of overlap with this idea of over control. So there might be this sense of perfectionism. There usually might be this, like, really successful, hardworking kind of flavor to it as well. And it's almost this idea of, instead of the emotions being kind of externalized, it's very much turned inward. Right? So it's interesting too how I think a lot of folks with quiet BPD might not get the same support a lot of the time, because it might be this real internal struggle that people don't really see as much. Okay. There can be this sense of kind of lacking these strong bonds with other people. Okay. There's actually a whole research study that was done on folks who had a diagnosis of BPD, and it was looking at the differences between over control and under control and kind of how that showed up. So if anyone's interested, or Bailey might already have this article, sure, but I'm happy to share it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so here we have this idea of acting in rather than acting out, downplay or hiding distress. So this is one where, we might say, oh yeah, I'm totally fine, when we're actually not really needing the support. And then again, we have this anger that can often be directed inwards. Okay, so kind of a lot of like internal beating ourselves up, or kind of the inner bully, as I like to call it. And then again, we have kind of this idea of a hypersensitive nervous system. So always having this kind of low grade or even like medium or high anxiety that's always there, looking out for all the dangers or the flaws. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit more here now about radically open DBT in particular. So for those of you who have done DBT, this will probably look very familiar in terms of the structure. So usually RO would be 30 weeks, and there would be individual sessions. There would be a skills class. We call it a class instead of a group in RO because they found that a lot of more over-controlled folks were very turned off by the word group, especially in kind of a therapy context. So we use the word class. There is telephone coaching as well. So basically, your therapist would be available for phone coaching outside of your session to kind of help with using the skills. And it's funny to kind of, we've noticed with the research and all that with RO is that it's very rarely used by, most over-controlled clients. Because again, it can be really hard to reach out and ask for support and show vulnerability and all of that. But I always encourage my clients to reach out as much as possible. And then we also have a weekly consultation meeting where therapists are recommended to meet with other RO therapists and practice all the skills ourselves, which is a lot of fun, being super vulnerable with colleagues. All right. So let's see here. So original DBT, again, is mostly about managing the kind of external symptoms. And folks who come to RO don't necessarily need to, learn how to kind of manage or, do emotion regulation or tolerate distress, or work harder or do whatever, because they're usually already really experts at that. So what we're doing in RO is really actually about trying to be able to express emotions more openly. Sometimes too, it's about being able to think in a more kind of flexible way. We tend to see sometimes there might be that real kind of sense of like black and white thinking, right? And kind of this difficulty with opening up to other people. And then, of course, we do talk a lot about kind of self-worth as well, and the way that we see ourselves and the way that we're talking to ourselves internally. Okay. So dialectical ideas here, and this is again similar with DBT, but we're really working on balancing this acceptance and change. Letting go of black and white thinking. So, we talk a lot about in RO how there's so many different ways to cook a potato, right? We're trying to really work on seeing things from so many different perspectives. There's a quote in there: we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, right? So we're really working on being mindful. And this can also help with perfectionism, right? So what does it mean to be perfect anyways? What does that mean to you? How can we look at it in different ways? If we're really stuck on the way things should be, right? I should be getting straight A's. I should be doing perfectly at this thing, whatever. Working on being a little bit more dialectical can help us kind of see things from 15 different angles instead of just one. Of course, since this is a behavioral therapy, we do focus on behavior. But a lot of what we want to focus on in RO is really about what is keeping us in this state of emotional loneliness, or keeping others from knowing how we're feeling or what we are needing. So we might track things like, eye rolls, maybe, or saying I'm fine when I'm not, or smiling when angry. These might be some of the behaviors that we're kind of honing in on. And I like to call these kind of our suit of armor behaviors, right? Like, what are we doing that might be kind of keeping people out or pushing people away? And these are kind of the main things that we're looking at. We do diary cards just like in DBT. So we're tracking our emotions throughout the week as well. And we do behavioral chains, which again, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this, but basically we're getting a real good idea of kind of the chain of events that happen. So for example, if I said I'm fine when I wasn't on Tuesday, I would kind of do a little bit of a chain on that and say what was happening for me that day, what were my vulnerabilities, what were my kind of thoughts and emotions and urges and sensations that were happening before I said I'm fine when I wasn't, and then what were the consequences. And then from there, we can kind of think about, what skills we could bring in next time we're having the urge to say I'm fine when I'm not. The goal being to really help others feel more connected to us and for us to get our needs met and all of those things. So again, just like a little bit of a recap here, that we are not focusing only on kind of our inner experiences, right? Our thoughts, our emotions, but we're also really putting an emphasis on our social signaling, meaning everything that we are doing, our behavior in the presence of other people. Okay. I hope everyone's doing good. It's funny talking to a bunch of little squares. I'm excited for questions after. Okay, so there's also a focus in RO-DBT on mindfulness. DBT has more of a background in Buddhism, whereas we have more of a background here in Malamati Sufism. I won't go into the details of the difference right now, but interesting little fact there. So with mindfulness, this is about really getting more curious about our thoughts and emotions and reactions and behaviors and urges in a non-judgmental way. We do work on recognizing and labeling emotions as well, just like in DBT. But it's interesting too, because a lot of folks who, come in for RO tend to be masters at kind of suppressing the emotions or pushing them down. So this can sometimes be a fun bit of the journey too, to really learn, to recognize and to kind of honor and notice and leave space for these emotions. Okay. We talk about valued goals. And then we have a very specific way in RO for what we call self-inquiry or self-examination. And this is a tool that we use to kind of get to know ourselves better. And it can be hard sometimes. I do self-inquiry a lot, and it's usually asking ourselves questions that we really don't want to we really don't want to go there. But I'm going to talk more about self-inquiry a little bit later on in the presentation, so we'll come back to that. Okay. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, there's a big focus as well on emotional connections in RO. So there's this idea that, we are social creatures. Humans, if we look at us from a, kind of physiological perspective, we're not very fast, we're not very strong. We don't have like big teeth. So, the idea is that when we were in cave person times, there was no way that we could have survived on our own. And our species really survived because we were able to work together in groups. So the theory here is that our nervous system really doesn't like to be isolated. It really doesn't like to feel, that we're not part of something, that we're not part of a community. The good news is that you only need one person that you really feel that sense of community with in order to kind of reap the benefits of emotional connection. But this is a really important part that we kind of talk a lot about in RO-DBT. And there's a big emphasis as well on the emotion of shame, because that emotion can really come up when we feel like, the possibility of being rejected by a group. So we really put a big focus on this as well. Okay. All right. So how does it differ? I think I've covered some of this already, but I have this nice little chart here. So there are some differences in terms of how kind of the therapist kind of sees things as well that I thought might be interesting to share here. In RO, the therapist tends to be a little bit less directive. There's more kind of emphasis on self-discovery and self-inquiry. Whereas with DBT, there's more kind of about external contingencies. I remember when I was learning DBT, there's a big emphasis on, withdrawing warmth, right? We're kind of supposed to be a little bit cold sometimes if there's a behavior that we want to discourage. And I always had so much trouble with that. So RO, we're taught to be like, more of a buddy, right? More of a friend, which I think is amazing. We use a lot of kind of social signaling in our sessions as well. So, if I'm like sitting upright like this and I'm like, okay, we're going to be serious today and we're going to talk about things. RO is more about like, I'm going to lean back, we're just going to like hang out and chat. It's not a big deal. Which can also be kind of nice to model that a little bit. We're also very goofy in our sessions. So there's a big kind of sense of humor piece to RO. That's kind of fun sometimes. What else here? We like to talk about kind of conflict. I think that sometimes in DBT, we talk about disengagement from conflict or avoiding escalation. In RO, I know for me, in my life, avoiding conflict was always a big thing that I did. And so it talks a lot about leaning into conflict and having those tough conversations as well. Okay. And then, yeah, we do tend to kind of, express a lot of emotions in sessions as well, which is fun. So yeah, so those are some of the differences. I'm just looking at the time here. So, oh yeah, so this is the little tool of self-inquiry that I wanted to leave everybody with today before we move on to questions. So we won't have time to kind of practice this all together right now, but I'll just kind of walk us through it, and then you can take it with you. I can send Bailey these slides as well. So self-inquiry is something that we can do in short bursts. We're only supposed to do it for 5 minutes at a time because we don't want it to turn into rumination or kind of obsessively thinking about something. But it's really just an invitation to get curious about ourselves or about a reaction that we might have had. So we can pick an emotional reaction that we had in the past week. So for example, I might use something like, I was at Costco the other day and there was a person in front of me with their cart and they were walking really, really slowly. And I started to get like really, really worked up and frustrated with this person. So that might be a reaction that I'm like, kind of want to know more about what was going on for me in that moment. What was it that made me so angry? Okay. And then we want to set a timer for 5 minutes And self-inquiry is all about finding a question that gets you closer to your personal unknown. So I could ask myself that question in that scenario, right? Like, what was it about that woman with her shopping cart that brought up so much anger for me? Or the example I had here, what was it about another little typo, forgetting to get milk at the store that caused me to feel so angry at myself? Okay, so we're writing our question at the top of the page. And then we're recording our thoughts, feelings, urges, memories, or any other reactions that kind of show up in response to that question. Okay, so we're writing down whatever shows up. Maybe it's, okay, yeah, like I really felt like I was in a rush at the grocery store, and I was reminded of the time when I was late for class that one day and I was really embarrassed. Whatever. So we can write down whatever shows up. And then we're asking ourselves, did this question move me closer to my personal unknown? Okay, so it's kind of that, like, am I just kind of going over things that I already know about myself? Or is this actually getting me closer to, to learning more, to kind of digging deeper? If not, what can I ask that will move me closer? So then we just kind of go back between 3 and 4 and 5. So asking ourselves a question, writing everything down that comes up, asking ourselves a question, writing everything down that comes up until the timer goes off. Okay. So this is one of those practices that I find it's hard to explain, and it's hard to kind of just think about it intellectually. You kind of just have to like throw yourself into it. But then you can use the questions that kind of brought up the most new learning for you the next day when you do your self-inquiry the next day. So something fun to play around with, and something you can kind of take away. Yeah, so that's it. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. I have some RO-DBT classes running virtually in BC and Ontario. So if anyone's interested, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to just chat as well. If you want to have like a coffee or a Zoom coffee or whatever. I always love to kind of meet people and chat about RO or chat about other things. So yeah, let me see. I'm going to check the chat here. Awesome. So I have a couple of questions from Bridget. Do you ever see people who fluctuate between over-controlled and under-controlled? Yes. Yeah, that is such a great question, Bridget. So oftentimes this is absolutely the case. And it's so common for folks to have a very over-controlled kind of persona at like work or school or whatever. And then just like you're saying with family members, that's kind of when kind of maybe more under-controlled presentation shows up. And it's interesting too to kind of look at what is actually the kind of underlying temperament there, because sometimes we can actually be more on the over-controlled side, but we're so good at holding it all in and holding it all in and holding it all in that when we come home at the end of the day, it kind of explodes. So it actually could be that is under control at the end, at the kind of base of it. And that, there might be that idea of like, how do we help you be more expressive at work, or, help you kind of not just keep everything in so that it kind of explodes when you get home. So usually people do tend to lean towards one side or the other, and really looking at that kind of temperament piece around, are you more cautious? Do you tend to be, as a kid, were you more shy and cautious, or were you more, active and impulsive? And that can kind of help us figure out whether it's kind of more over control or under control. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Okay. And then Bridget says, how does the self-inquiry exercise differ from avoid rumination about selected emotional events? Yeah, that's exactly it, Bridget. So it's about the timer. We definitely don't want to go over the 5 minutes. And it's also about being really careful that we're not kind of beating ourselves up. We're not trying to problem solve, which I think sometimes rumination or overthinking is like, we're trying to solve a problem where there might not actually be a solution, or maybe it's not even a problem. So as soon as we start to go into beating ourselves up or problem solving, we want to kind of pause and go, okay, I need to find a new question that's not taking me down this route. And then, yeah, definitely stopping when that timer goes off is really important as well. Okay. Is it helpful to do both DBT and RO-DBT simultaneously? I would say that it would probably be way too much to do both at the same time. I would honestly, I think some people genuinely fall on both sides, but I would say that getting like a really good kind of assessment or idea of the temperament would really help point people towards the more appropriate one. And that would be really important. Although I have had some clients as well who have done DBT first, especially if there's some like really intense, life-threatening kind of behaviors going on. And sometimes a round of getting DBT and getting those like real kind of, coping skills or distress tolerance can be helpful first. And then moving on to RO next can be helpful. So yeah, I think it really depends on the person, but I would say doing them at the same time would be probably really overwhelming. Okay. And then what is the overlap between overcontrol and trauma responses, such as fawn? Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. So yeah, I think that most mental health, this is, I guess, kind of more of a personal opinion, but I would say most mental health kind of whatever disorders or diagnoses or whatever you want to call them are kind of trauma underneath it all. Whether that's like big T trauma or, just not just or invalidation, right, that we've experienced. So I definitely think that depending on the person, RO can be helpful, with those trauma symptoms. So, for example, if being invalidated whenever we expressed an emotion has caused us to, to maybe just shut down our emotions, right? Or to kind of freeze or then RO could really kind of support with that tendency and kind of help us understand where that comes from. And of course, I'm also a huge fan of like trauma therapies specifically. So if there are like specific traumas that are feeling really stuck and that kind of need a little bit more than that, then, I think that RO can only go so far in really addressing those behaviors, but sometimes we do need to go deeper into more of the like EMDR kind of CPT stuff, more trauma therapy specific. Yeah. Okay, Elisa, is it possible for DBT to be kind of counterproductive and maybe harmful? Yes, that is also such a great question. Yeah, so I have had a couple of clients, And I think DBT is incredible as well. So I don't want to like, you know, I don't want to kind of say bad things about it, but I have heard from some people who have done DBT, who have been on the over controlled side, that it has actually kind of made things worse for them, because of that very idea that they are already so good at regulating their emotions, and tolerating distress, that it kind of just reinforces that idea that, like, you know, you need to just distract yourself, or you need to, you know, sit with the emotion and feel it, and, you know, and you need to kind of like keep your impulses in, and you need to, you know, talk in a very controlled way when you talk to people. Like, there's so many messages there that could actually be really counter productive. So yeah, so absolutely. So I think that's really important to kind of get, you know, get that proper assessment, and kind of go through some of those checklists, and thinking about temperament and all of that too. Yeah. Awesome. Any other questions or thoughts? All right. Well, thank you all again, for coming, and I'm so happy to share these slides or share any other resources, if anyone is looking for different resources about RO. I'm happy to chat anytime. Yeah. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was wonderful. I learned a lot.
Good. Awesome. Thanks so much again, Bailey, for having me.